Hello and welcome back to SGTV. Today we are joined by our Head of Technical Engagement, Jake, who is going to be answering some of our questions that have been sent in to us about different parts of the industry, different regs. So it's a little bit Q&A this one, and if we can open it up and dive in to give you some examples to explain it further, we will do. But this one today, it's about external influences. So not as in like bad role models or don't do drugs or anything like that. This is about what environmental conditions must be considered when selecting and installing a wiring system.
Okay.
So I think there's quite a lot to this one. So at the start of this, I've got ambient temperature. So
Okay, well, before we do that, Ben, the series of regulations that we're concerned with here is under 522. So again, as you mentioned, it's all to do with external influences. And it's probably important to say that any examples that we give in here today is, we're not limiting them to one particular thing that we need to consider. There could be multiple things that are attributed to it. Now, just for example, before we get into it, you've got the IP rated socket there. That's going to be going outdoors. It's going to be in the sun. There's lots of different things that we need to consider, not just one example. But we're going to try and pick out some examples and some things that are probably more considered than others in different locations, if that makes sense.
that's why we got you here. Supposed to know your stuff, so we'll test that out. So yeah, ambient temperature. I've got that on my sheet here. So what can you tell me about ambient temperature in terms of how you'd select and install a product?
Well, again, every product's going to have a temperature rating of some description. So some of the parameters that it can work in, whether that's minus temperatures or plus temperatures of, severe heat. So we need to make sure that when we're selecting a set product, we're also considering where it's going. So the external influence part of it is that, let's say that you're putting, I don't know, we've already got a few select examples here, but let's say we're putting this inside a kitchen area.
Like a commercial kitchen?
Yeah, like a commercial kitchen, it's rated correctly for what's going to be happening in there, etc. But we do need to take into consideration that actually the kitchen's going to be at a raised level. Now, I'm not suggesting that this is going to get too hot, but the components inside or the terminals may be affected by the external ambient temperature of that kitchen. So we need to position it in a way where it's sort of in a cooler part of the kitchen.
So you're not going to put this, say, right next to a cooker or a furnace or something like that?
Absolutely not, no.
So would that, on my list here I've got external heat sources, but they sort of link in because ambient is what's around you, but then as we're talking about installing these kind of products in commercial places like a kitchen, might be a silly question, but would it make any difference as to say, in my mind, I'm thinking, okay, something metal or decorative that's metal, that's going to conduct heat more than, say, a plastic switch or a socket. So would that make any difference of where you'd install them?
Yeah, again, you have got the external heat sources from like an oven or a hob of some description. Look, you're never going to put these over the top of that because, quite frankly, it's going to be quite ridiculous.
I've seen it happen.
I've seen it happen, but if you were designing it as a new installation and you had it all set out, you're not generally going to do that because of the external influences. But so this one will obviously heat up being metal, but again, depends how often it's going to be touched. And then the plastic, you're going to have to put some serious heat through it in order for it to melt. So it's one of them ones where you have to take it into consideration. Typically speaking, you're not going to pay as much attention to it as you would an ambient temperature.
So are there any guides that will dictate the distance from, say, a heat source?
Yeah. There's lots of guides out there, especially in commercial kitchens. There's lots of information about that. But when it comes more back down to a domestic level, we've got the NHBC. They provide guidance and tell people where to install cooker switches, how far away they need to be, how far they need to be away from a sink, etc. So yes, there is other ones.
Okay. So I know from speaking to some of our sales team that some of the Deco Plus, even down to the metal clad, that was installed at a Fat Macy's kitchen restaurant. So that just sort of shows that you're not limited to just your basic sort of commercial setup. You can, depending on the layout and the design of that kitchen or restaurant, you do have that variety of products to install there.
And again, whoever was designing Fat Macy's kitchen would have taken into consideration 522 with all of the list of external influences there when selecting their products to go into that installation. For example, the metal clad stuff, and I don't know the job specifically, but they would have taken into consideration the fact that you probably needed to have an impact rating. People are moving cages or taking in food deliveries, or people are barging past outside the back of house because they're trying to rush around. So they would have taken into consideration and put a metal clad there. There's no good putting in a plastic one where it's in a high impact area and it could potentially get damaged. Otherwise, people will just constantly go in and having to change it. That's why they select something that's appropriate with the external influences.
So, for example, like loading corridors into the kitchen, storerooms, places like that, where you are ramming trolleys in and out.
Look, they're not meant to be used in that way. Let's get that quite
You're not meant
clear.
to just hammer the hell out of that.
No, there's no good just bashing cages into it on purpose, but it does have an impact rating, and it will say that they can take some level of impact before they break, as where something that's plastic would suggest that actually that it's not rated for that.
Okay. What about presence of water or humidity? Again, we've touched on kitchens, but there might be more
I've got
instances.
another example for you on that one if you want. When we look at humidity, let's go for a swimming pool or some description like that. Again, it's no good putting something like this in where there's going to be high humidity, because high humidity is going to create moisture, and that moisture will then be attracted to that, get inside the terminals, and then cause either a short or something more severe where people are touching it and then they could potentially get an electric shock. Generally speaking, when people are in a swimming pool, the body resistance is less, therefore we need to take more consideration. So if you are seeing sockets around a swimming pool, not that we advise that, but if that's the way that the designer's designed it, you're going to need something that's going to be able to block out the humidity and the moisture as well. So you would go for something like an IP rated socket.
And with these being sealed in, the advice would to obviously be use them as they're meant to be used, not left open, because as you said, even though that's a plastic socket, even with the rubber gasket seals around the back, it's not just the plate that's going to absorb that moisture, it's going to be inside, it's going to be the terminals, and that could have...
Yeah, I mean, they've all got seals on them. Make sure the lids are closed. If you are using them with a socket, again, there's some nice gaskets in the bottom there that will seal it back up when you put the lid on as well. So.
Okay, Jake. So next on my sheet here, we've got presence of flora and or mold growth. So what can you tell me about that?
Okay, so we've got, as an example, we need to be aware that there are times where, let's say we've got a house and it's covered in ivy, for example. Now we need to suitably select, I'm trying to get that word right here, suitably select a box, for example. If we're going to feed a garage, it's no good just putting terminal blocks on the outside. We need to protect it from the external influences, which is the plants. Ivy would have a tendency to try and get in and around them terminals. We need to make sure it's protected. So we'd use something like a Q-net box, which again has got an IP rating on the box, but that would ensure that none of that flora would get inside the terminals and the connections.
So we've covered flora, and then obviously we've got fauna next. So, I mean, what is fauna, first of all?
It's rodents. So it could be, say rodents, it could be insects, it could be like wood lice, it could be spiders, etc., getting inside products. The best example that I probably can give you on this one is working in thatched properties, so cottages that have got thatched roofs, for example. Rodents tend to get inside there. Now, all the cables within a thatched building should, and the Dorset model will actually be protected with either conduit or Copex or something like that, or be wide and armoured in some cases, because the protection that is needed on there is to stop rodents getting in there and chewing through the cables. So the presence of fauna is important in so much as that we need to ensure that we need to protect the cables.
Pretty simple then.
Pretty simple.
Making sure nothing's getting in, nothing's chewing through cables.
Yeah.
Obviously that could have detrimental effects. It could cause arcing, could burn a house down. Yep. So that's something as simple as that can make such a huge difference.
I mean, look, there's lots of other examples on that, but I think the best example I've seen in an actual life experience is that where squirrels have got into a loft space and they started chewing through cables. So we had to rewire the whole system, but we had to put it back in a way that the external influence, being the squirrel, couldn't get to the cables.
Yeah, I know from one of our case studies, we've had people install some of our ESP CCTV cameras in one of these big treetop trail courses. So obviously you're running cable up to trees, it's going to have that same thing, isn't it? You're going to have squirrels going up there, making sure that cable's armoured or
whether it's in some sort of conduit, is probably the best way, or flexible conduit. Again, ensuring that those insects, rodents, whatever it may be, can't gain access to the system.
And does that come under a specific regulation or part of one of the regs?
In what sense?
As in, is there a document or a guide that says if you're installing this kind of product in this type of environment, you have to stick to this to prevent people from saying just running twin and earth up a tree or something?
Yeah, it's just there, man. 522.10.
522.10. I was listening. Okay, so I've also got building design, and I'll elaborate further on this because it's talking about structural movement. So how what can you tell me about that?
Well, if you imagine that we've got a really tall building, I'm not suggesting here maybe, but other parts of the world where there's movement in the ground, the building's going to have to move. So you're going to have to install your system accordingly. There's no point putting your system rigid when there's a building that's sort of moving. That's pretty much all that is. It's not taken into a massive consideration here, but it does play a part in it as well.
Does that bring into account seismic, however you pronounce that, activities? I know we don't really get much here. Yeah. You wake up sometimes and be like, oh, did anyone hear the earthquake? No, didn't, no.
No, again, it's something that we don't really take into consideration. I mean, high-level design would do, yeah, because they'll know where the plates are and all of that in certain locations within the country, but people that are jobbing contractors generally wouldn't take that into consideration.
Okay. So what about the presence of solid foreign bodies? What does that entail?
That's more around the IP ratings, and each individual product will have a set IP rating, so ingress protection rating. Now, it will talk about the foreign bodies, and it will talk about ingress of water, so ingress of particles or dust, and ingress of fluids. It doesn't have to be water necessarily, but there's a consideration that needs to happen when it comes to different products. We spoke about swimming pools, so the IP rating again will dictate as to where that can go in a particular swimming pool. So let's just say IP65, we can say that it can go up to a certain level of water, whether it's splashing from the external influence, or the 6 will refer to what type of dust protection it's got. So
that would maybe determine whether, if it's going in, say, factories or something, or workshops where you got a lot of dust or different particles.
Yep.
Okay. What about the presence of corrosive or polluting substances? Because this is different to IP, because this is stuff that could potentially damage your equipment.
Yeah, so...
Not that IP can't damage your equipment, obviously, because it can, but this is talking more of the lines of, chemicals.
Let's say that we're working in a recycling centre and people are bringing paint and chemicals into there to be recycled. Then, again, you've got to take that into consideration. That's an external influence that could have a detrimental impact on the piece of equipment that's in the place. So it's no good putting lights on the floor that are not suitable for chemicals to be put on them. So if imagine you've got pathways that are lit up, well, if the paint tips over, it's going to damage the lights. It's all about making sure that the piece of equipment that you're using or the installation that you're installing is fit for purpose.
Okay, and then how does vibration come into it? I mean, we seem to be sort of, it's almost like a stage where you can see, okay, I'm looking at factories, I'm looking at those kind of buildings, obviously going to have mechanical equipment. What about vibration? How would that impact the type of products you're going to install into that?
But if we think of a three-phase board in a factory, it's no good that just keep vibrating all the time. So if there's pieces of machinery around it that are vibrating and moving, because that's the nature of them, if that's vibrating too much, we could see an instance where the terminals are going to sort of lax or come loose over a period of time because of the vibration. It's just something that happens. You can't stop that. But it's making sure that we prepare for that when we're installing it and saying, well, we're not going to install it there because there's going to be a piece of machinery that's going to vibrate, so we need to install it over there.
And that kind of thing, 522.7, check me out. It's only because I've got it written down here. So here's an unusual one. Solar radiation and ultraviolet radiation, UV.
Yeah, that's something else that we need to take into consideration. So the types of cables that we're using, so whether it's a PVC cable, for example, if that's been installed outdoor in direct sunlight, that's going to have an impact on the longevity of that piece of cable. It could start damaging, start corroding over a period of time if it is in direct sunlight. So again, we need to make sure that when we're installing our systems, we choose the correct wiring system. So if it needs to be in conduit, to be protected against that, to stop that external influence having an impact on it.
Okay. What part of the reg does that come under?
It's definitely under 522. I'll give you that.
0.11.
There you go.
There you go. He's good, but I put him on the spot on that one. We've covered seismic effects, which isn't really anything that would affect us here all that much, hopefully anyway. What about movement of air?
That's really to do with process materials, or you got to think about a warehouse and the way that the doors are opening and shutting. If you're putting lights up, the movement of air could damage the lights over a period of time. Let's say that they're hanging on a chain and that chain then is damaged. You could see that it's damaged from there. Okay,
so obviously throughout this conversation we've mentioned different parts, 522.13 or etc. So how would someone looking through our product range, whether that's Glico, Via, Unicrim, PSP, determine which products meet that criteria? Do we have that kind of product information?
That's a very good question. We have IP ratings, mainly IK ratings for impact, and generally speaking, that's all we can do in terms of our products. So we can provide you with those ratings. All the other stuff all the other parts that we've spoken about are to do with somebody's assessment of the situation. So the vibration, for example, if it's next to machinery, don't put it there, put it somewhere else. That we can't do anything to sort of combat that. The QNet box that we mentioned, it's IP rated, but it's up to you not to put it in the middle of a set of plants because there could be potential. We have to take that into consideration. The series of regulations that if anybody's going to look for it is 522, so just take that into consideration. And as we've mentioned the products throughout and we've mentioned different places, it's almost like a tick list. You go through when you are installing any piece of equipment, you go, right, okay, well, do I need to think about this? Do I need to think about this? And so on and so forth. Find them all under 522 and you'll be good to go.
And swat up on it, absorb it, learn it, makes all the difference.
Yep.
Okay, well, Jake, I think you've covered everything we've got on here. I hope that was useful. I hope people watching this has found that useful. And if you have questions or subjects that you want us to cover,
or if we're wrong about anything,
yeah, feel free to correct us. Yeah, but please do get in contact, and we'd be more than happy to do an episode on this, and we'll dive in and we'll try and dissect it and answer it as best as we can. Well, Jake can, because I just ask questions. But as always, here at SGTV, if you like what you're seeing, please remember to like, subscribe, hit the notification button below, and we'll see you in the next video.